The desert sun was still rising when she first heard the deep, chopping roar of rotor blades. She was just a child then, no taller than the fence she leaned against, eyes squinting at the horizon as the helicopter thundered across the sky. Dust swirled in its wake, the ground trembled faintly, and the machine itself seemed less like metal and bolts than a living creature, fierce, untouchable, free. Most children might have covered their ears at the deafening sound, but not her. She stood rooted in awe, watching as the silhouette cut through the clouds. Something inside her shifted in that moment. She didn't just want to see helicopters. She wanted to fly them. It was a dream born in an instant, and one that would follow her into adulthood. Growing up, she didn't come from a family of aviators or soldiers. Her parents encouraged her to aim high in school, to think about respectable careers: doctor, teacher, lawyer. Flying helicopters, especially combat helicopters, wasn't on anyone's list for a young girl. But for her, the seed was planted. She began to devour anything she could find about aviation. Library shelves provided biographies of World War II pilots, manuals on aerodynamics, and thick binders about military aircraft. She traced her fingers over black and white photographs of female pilots who ferried planes in wartime, and her imagination lit up. But one aircraft stood above all the rest: the AH-64 Apache. It wasn't just a helicopter. It was a predator, a tank in the sky. Armed with a 30mm chain gun, Hellfire missiles, and rockets, the Apache could deliver destruction with terrifying precision. To her, the Apache represented power and protection. Its pilots didn't just fly. They commanded the battlefield. That was where she wanted to be. As she grew older, the dream grew heavier. Teachers and mentors warned her to be realistic. Friends told her that combat aviation was a man's world. A guidance counselor once said, with a soft smile, "You should think about careers that are more suited to women. Something safer." But each warning only hardened her resolve. She threw herself into academics, knowing she'd need stellar grades to compete for military programs. Science and math became her strongest subjects. In high school, she spent long hours in physics labs, trying to understand not just how things flew, but why they stayed airborne. At the same time, she was an athlete, pushing her body through cross-country runs and weight training to toughen herself for the physical tests she knew were coming. When her peers were going to football games or dances, she was often studying helicopter schematics or running drills. To some, it looked obsessive. To her, it felt necessary. Because she knew this: no one was going to hand her a seat in an Apache. She would have to fight for it. Her first step came when she joined the Reserve Officers Training Course, ROTC, at college. Here, the divide was clear. Male cadets were plentiful, loud, and confident. Female cadets were few, and watched constantly. From day one, she understood. She wasn't seen as just another cadet. She was the girl cadet. That meant every mistake would be magnified, every slip of discipline whispered about. But instead of shrinking under the pressure, she embraced it. On early morning runs, she pushed herself to finish ahead of half the men. In tactical exercises, she volunteered for the most difficult roles. She wasn't loud about it. She let her performance speak for her. Slowly, grudgingly, some of the skepticism faded. Still, there were those who doubted. "Flying combat birds isn't for women," one senior cadet muttered during a training session. Too much pressure, too much danger. She didn't answer him then. She just tightened her laces and ran another mile. The day she was accepted into flight training felt like crossing a threshold. She received her orders with shaking hands, heart pounding as though she were already in the cockpit. It wasn't the finish line. It was only the beginning. But it meant the system hadn't beaten her yet. Flight school was grueling. Days started before dawn, with physical conditioning that left her legs aching and her lungs burning. After that came classroom lessons, hours of aerodynamics, navigation, weapon systems, and emergency procedures. By afternoon, they were in simulators, practicing maneuvers that demanded split-second reflexes and absolute focus. The instructors were tough, relentless. Some were supportive, treating her no differently than the men. Others were openly skeptical, watching her with crossed arms, waiting for her to fail. But failure was a luxury she didn't allow herself. Every mistake became a lesson. Every night was another chance to study harder, drill longer, prepare better. And then came the day she strapped herself into the cockpit of a real helicopter for the first time. The first flight wasn't in an Apache yet. It was in a training helicopter. But the sensation was unforgettable. The vibration of the engine, the hum of the blades overhead, the sudden lift as the aircraft broke free from the earth. She gripped the controls, nerves surging through her veins, but then steadied. The instructor's voice crackled over the headset. "Take us up." And she did. The machine obeyed her touch, rising into the sky. A smile crept over her face, despite her best efforts to remain calm. She was flying, really flying. That moment crystallized her years of dreaming and training. She wasn't watching from the ground anymore. She was where she belonged. Of course, the Apache remained the ultimate goal. Few pilots earned the right to fly it. The program was selective, ruthless in weeding out those who couldn't handle the pressure. But when the time came to submit her aircraft preference, she didn't hesitate. She wrote one word: Apache. It was bold. Some of her peers chose safer paths, transport helicopters, reconnaissance aircraft, where competition was less fierce. She chose the hardest road, knowing the odds stacked against her as both a young pilot and a woman. But fortune favored preparation. When assignments were posted weeks later, she scanned the list with racing eyes. And there it was, next to her name, AH-64 Apache. Her heart leapt. This was it. This was the dream finally taking form. When she told her parents, they were proud but nervous. Her mother asked quietly, "Why the Apache? It's a war machine." She answered simply, "Because it's where I can do the most." Her father, less emotional, just nodded. "Then you better be the best." She intended to be. The first time she walked onto the flight line and saw the Apache up close, it was breathtaking. Photographs hadn't done it justice. The sheer bulk of it, bristling with weaponry, seemed alive even as it sat silent. Its twin rotors gleamed in the sun, its long nose angled like a predator about to strike. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal beneath her palm. This was no longer a distant dream. This was reality. And yet, as she strapped in for her first Apache training flight, she knew the hardest battles weren't just ahead in the skies. They would be on the ground, in the fight to prove she belonged here at all. But for now, in that moment, as the rotors began to spin and the earth fell away beneath her, the years of doubt and struggle melted into silence. She was flying, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first time she climbed into the cockpit of the A-64 Apache, the world seemed to narrow down to the panels of instruments and the faint vibration running through the seat beneath her. It was a beast, far different from the smaller trainers. She had mastered. Every lever, every switch, every screen seemed designed to overwhelm. This was not a machine that forgave mistakes. This was the sharp edge of war, packed into a cockpit barely wide enough for two, and yet, to her, it felt like home. She had worked relentlessly for this moment. Flight school had weeded out cadets who faltered under pressure, those who froze in simulators or buckled under endless check rides. By the time she made it here, she had already proved herself more resilient than most. But now came the real test. This wasn't just about keeping a helicopter airborne. It was about commanding a flying weapons platform that could turn the tide of a battle. The instructors knew it. The other trainees knew it. And deep down, so did she. From day one, the Apache program demanded absolute focus. Training flights lasted hours, each exercise layered with complexity. They practiced gunnery runs until the recoil of the 30mm chain gun felt like part of the aircraft itself. They drilled night missions using night vision goggles, straining their eyes through green-lit darkness, navigating terrain that looked more like a ghostly outline than the world they knew. There were weapon systems to master, Hellfire missiles that could lock onto a target miles away, Hydra rockets that had to be fired in bursts, precise enough to avoid friendly lines. There were emergency procedures drilled until muscle memory. Replaced panic, engine flameouts, electrical failures, hydraulic leaks, incoming fire. The instructors had a saying, "If you panic in an Apache, you're already dead." She didn't panic. She learned. She absorbed. She adapted. Still, learning wasn't enough. Inside her unit, she could feel the weight of expectation pressing against her at every turn. Some of it was unspoken. A glance from an instructor who paused a beat too long before nodding approval. A mutter from a fellow trainee when her name went up on the flight schedule. A casual joke in the mess hall about how this isn't Top Gun for girls. And some of it was spoken outright. One evening, after a long day of simulator runs, a male trainee leaned against the barracks wall and smirked at her. "You know, they'll never put you in a real combat rotation, right? They'll let you train, let you log hours. But when the bullets start flying, don't hold your breath." She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. The next morning, she outflew him in every drill. It wasn't that she wanted to humiliate anyone. She wasn't trying to make enemies. But she understood something critical she could not afford. Mediocrity. For the men in her class, an error in judgment was a mark against them, but not a final verdict. For her, any mistake confirmed the doubts that hovered in the air like smoke. If she misjudged an approach, it wasn't a bad landing. It was proof women can't handle Apaches. So she eliminated mistakes. She drilled harder, stayed later, studied longer. Where others closed their binders after dinner, she kept hers open until midnight. When others took weekends off, she booked simulator hours. She wasn't just learning to fly an Apache. She was preparing to fight a war on two fronts, one in the skies, the other in the culture around her. The cockpit itself was both sanctuary and trial ground. Squeezed into the front seat, helmet snug against the headset, she felt the duel. Controls like an extension of her body. Her hands rested on the collective and cyclic, the Apache responding with twitch-quick obedience. Every vibration, every pitch of the rotor blade translated through her bones. But sitting behind her in the pilot's seat was often an instructor waiting for a slip. "Too much pitch," one barked over the intercom during a low-level run. "Do it again." "Your descent rate's sloppy," another said, after a simulated landing. "You think the Apache forgives sloppy?" And when she nailed the maneuver, when the aircraft settled on its skids as smooth as glass, there was silence. No praise. No acknowledgement. Just a note scribbled on a clipboard. She didn't need applause. She needed progress. What kept her going was the aircraft itself. The Apache was unforgiving, yes, but it was also magnificent. She loved the way the nose dipped forward as it surged into attack runs. She loved the rhythm of the chain gun, the way its firepower vibrated through her chest. She loved the eerie green glow of the cockpit during night missions, the sense of slipping like a shadow across enemy terrain. Every flight made her hungrier. Every hour in the air carved away at the doubt she carried. But outside the cockpit, those doubts returned like ghosts. When graduation from Apache training neared, the trainees gathered for a final briefing. Commanders praised the class for surviving a course many never finished. Then, assignments were handed out. Most pilots were slotted quickly into combat units. She waited, heart pounding, until her name was finally called. Her assignment wasn't combat. It was logistics, support flights, training rotations. The kind of roles no one dreamed of when they first touched an Apache. She kept her face impassive, but inside, the decision stung like a blade. She had matched her classmates flight for flight, test for test. And yet, when it came time to send pilots into the line of fire, they'd chosen others, not her. That night, she sat in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Around her, the barracks buzzed with chatter. Men celebrating combat slots, making plans, bragging about the future. She stayed silent, fists clenched in the dark. For some, the assignment might have been enough. After all, she was flying Apaches. She had achieved what many only dreamed of. But to her, it felt hollow. What good was mastering the aircraft if she wasn't trusted to use it when it mattered most? She didn't want to be a passenger in history. She wanted to write it. Over the weeks that followed, she flew her assigned missions, training flights, transport support, exercises. Each one she treated as seriously as combat, sharpening her skills until they became instinct. Word spread. Crew chiefs began to respect her meticulous inspections. Younger pilots sought her advice. Even some instructors, who once doubted her, admitted, quietly, that she had surpassed expectations. But the decision-makers, the ones who held the keys to combat assignments, still resisted. And so she made herself a promise. The day would come when circumstances left them no choice but to send her into battle. And when that day came, she would not just prove she belonged, she would make them regret ever doubting her at all. For now she flew in the shadows of others, logging hours in the Apache, waiting for opportunity. But opportunity has a way of appearing when least expected. And though she didn't yet know it, the battle she longed for, the one that would test everything she had worked for, was already on the horizon. The Apache thundered like a beast beneath her hands, blades chopping the air as she guided it across the training range. Dust spiraled behind her, and the chain gun rattled with deadly precision as her rounds tore into distant targets. From inside the cockpit, it was easy to believe she had proven herself beyond doubt. Every maneuver was sharp, every strike accurate, every landing controlled. She had done everything required and more. But when the missions were posted on the unit board, her name was absent from the combat lists. Again, it became a pattern she could not ignore. The men in her class were cycling through combat assignments, their call signs appearing on rosters that would send them into the thick of war. They came back from deployments with stories, battle scars, and respect. Meanwhile, her orders remained the same: training rotations, ferry flights, logistics. When she asked her commanding officer about it, the answers were polished but empty. Your time will come. Right now, we need you where you are. We're looking at unit readiness. Every phrase sounded official. None of it felt honest. She could see through it, the hesitation, the doubt. Her superiors didn't believe she belonged in combat. At first, she tried to reason with herself. Maybe it was timing. Maybe it was chance. After all, not everyone could be sent into the field at once. But as weeks turned into months, the excuses piled up, and the reality became undeniable. They were keeping her on the sidelines. Each morning, she put on her flight suit and went through the motions. But beneath the discipline, frustration grew like a fire. She hadn't fought this hard, sacrificed this much, just to be treated as ornamental. The insult stung deeper because she had seen her peers falter, She had watched men botch landing runs, overshoot gunnery targets, freeze in simulators. Mistakes that would have crippled her career were brushed aside as rough days. For them, there was always another chance. For her, perfection wasn't optional. It was survival. And yet, perfection still wasn't enough. One evening, after a briefing, she overheard two officers speaking in low tones. "She's good," one admitted. "Good's not the issue," the other replied. "You really want to risk the first. Female Apache pilot in a hot zone? If she goes down, it's not just her. It's the politics, the backlash." The words sliced through her like shrapnel. She wasn't being sidelined because she wasn't ready. She was being sidelined because they feared what her failure might symbolize. But she didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a soldier. That night, she sat alone in her quarters, staring at her helmet resting on the desk. Its dark visor reflected her face back at her, a face lined with exhaustion, but lit with determination. If they wouldn't hand her combat, she would make herself impossible to ignore. Her new routine became brutal. After official flights ended, she stayed in the simulator for hours, practicing emergency landings until her fingers bled from gripping the controls. She memorized every technical manual cover to cover, quizzing herself on procedures until she could recite them in her sleep. During field exercises, she volunteered for the hardest assignments: night landings in rough terrain, low-level navigation. Through canyons, weapons tests in punishing crosswinds. Her instructors noted her precision, her relentless drive. But her commanders remained unmoved. The wall of denial wasn't just professional, it was cultural. In the mess hall, she noticed the subtle shift when she entered. Conversations pausing, eyes sliding toward her, smirks exchanged. During briefings, when she asked sharp questions, they were sometimes ignored until a male peer repeated them. Even in casual banter, there was always an edge, reminders that she was an outsider in a fraternity that had existed long before she arrived. "Hey, RB pilot," one joked during maintenance checks. "Don't scratch the paint." She didn't laugh. She didn't respond. She simply climbed into the Apache and flew a flawless test run. Her silence was her weapon. Her excellence was her reply. But silence came with a cost. Some nights, the weight of it all pressed on her chest. Alone in the barracks, she wondered if they would ever see her as more than an exception. Was all the sacrifice worth it if she would never be allowed to do the very thing she trained for? She thought of the girl she once was, staring at helicopters in the sky, vowing she would one day fly them. That girl had not dreamed of support flights or paperwork. She had dreamed of war, of being part of something larger, of protecting soldiers on the ground who needed her firepower overhead. To stop now would mean betraying that promise, so she pushed harder. Her chance came, briefly, during a large-scale joint exercise. Units from multiple bases gathered, simulating battlefield scenarios. For the first time, her name appeared on a combat simulation roster, a mock strike mission against enemy positions. The operation was designed to test coordination between air and ground units. Conditions were chaotic: high winds, dust storms, constant radio chatter. She flew with calm precision. While others struggled to maintain formations, she anticipated maneuvers, adjusting seamlessly. Her gunnery runs were sharp, her communication clear. The ground units reported higher effectiveness under her support than any other pilot that day. When the exercise ended, even the skeptics were forced to acknowledge her performance. But once the exercise was over, reality returned. Her name disappeared from the rosters again. The denial became unbearable after one mission briefing. She sat in the back of the room, listening as assignments were handed out for an upcoming deployment overseas. Pilot after pilot was named. She waited, heart hammering. Her name never came. When the meeting ended, She stayed seated, fists clenched. The room emptied, the sound of boots fading down the hallway. Alone, she stared at the empty assignment board. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was rage. Rage at the double standards. Rage at the wasted potential. Rage at being trusted enough to train, but not enough to fight. She vowed then that she would force their hand. From that moment, everything she did carried a sharper edge. She began mentoring younger pilots, quietly building allies who respected her skills. She studied battle reports, analyzing combat tactics as though she were already in the field. She kept her Apache in perfect condition, every pre-flight inspection thorough, every maintenance note double-checked. If opportunity came suddenly, as it always did in war, she would be ready. Because deep down, she knew something her commanders had forgotten. War doesn't wait for approval stamps. War doesn't care about politics. War has a way of breaking down barriers. And when that war came, when the unit was stretched thin and every pilot was needed, they would no longer have the luxury of denial. They would send her. And when they did, she would prove them all wrong. For now, the wall of denial still stood, heavy and immovable. But she had already begun to see the cracks forming. And in the silence of her own determination, she prepared for the moment when the wall would finally shatter. The hangar lights glowed dimly in the pre-dawn hours, long before most of the unit stirred. The smell of hydraulic oil and jet fuel lingered in the air, heavy and metallic. She stood there alone, helmet tucked under one arm, staring up at the silhouette of the Apache. It wasn't her mission day. She wasn't scheduled for a sortie. But she had requested simulator hours at dawn, before anyone else. If command wasn't going to give her combat missions, she would create her own battles in the machines that mimicked them. Sleep had become secondary. Rest was a luxury. What mattered now was readiness. Others trained to meet the standard. She trained to crush it. Her daily cycle became something no one else dared to match. Morning, running laps around the base until her lungs burned, pushing herself past the point where most collapsed. She carried sandbags and dragged weighted sleds, imagining soldiers she might one day have to rescue under fire. Afternoon, flight, drills, simulator repetitions, manual checks. She practiced emergency procedures again and again. Engine failures, hydraulic leaks, fuel fires. She forced herself to recover from simulated crashes until muscle memory replaced panic. Evening, study. She spread out manuals and tactical reports across her desk, poring over them with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for an operation. She memorized weapon systems line by line, learned the intricacies of avionics, dissected every possible malfunction. Night. While others went to the barracks, she sneaked back into the hangar. She'd sit in the cockpit of a powered-down Apache for hours, flicking switches, tracing every wire, rehearsing sequences in the dark. The Apache became more than an aircraft. It became an extension of her body. Her peers began to notice. At first, it was whispers. She's always in the sim. Does she even sleep? Then curiosity. Younger pilots started asking her for tips, sitting beside her during drills, watching how she calibrated her maneuvers. Some even admitted that her precision embarrassed them. One night, a fellow pilot, a man who once dismissed her chances, found her in the hangar, helmet on, strapping herself into the cockpit of a shut-down Apache. "You're crazy," he muttered. "Nobody else does this." She didn't. Look up. That's why nobody else will be ready when it counts. Her obsession carried a cost. Her body ached constantly. Her hands were calloused from gripping controls, her shoulders sore from the endless repetitions. She went days on 4 hours of sleep, eyes bloodshot, nerves wired with caffeine and determination. There were nights when doubt whispered in her ear, "Why are you doing this?" they'll never let you in. No matter how ready you are, they'll keep you on the sidelines. But she silenced the voice by pushing harder, because she knew something the doubters didn't. When war erupted, hesitation and bias wouldn't matter. What would matter was who was best prepared. And she was determined that when the time came, no one would be sharper than her. The simulators became her battlefield. She requested scenarios designed to overwhelm, missions that simulated chaos in combat zones. She flew against waves of enemy fire, navigating through anti-aircraft defenses, dodging missile locks, coordinating with ground forces. One particular exercise became legend among instructors. It simulated a worst-case mission: engine fire, weapon failure, hostile radar locking on, ground troops trapped in crossfire. Most pilots failed within minutes. She flew it to completion, landing the Apache on fumes, systems crippled, but ground troops saved. When the simulation ended, the instructor removed his headset slowly, staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and respect. "I've never seen anyone finish that," he admitted. She just wiped the sweat from her brow. "That won't be the last time." Her reputation began to shift. Crew chiefs started trusting her to inspect aircraft before flights. Maintenance crews joked that she knew the Apache better than they did. Even some of the skeptical instructors grudgingly admitted her discipline was unmatched. But the commanders, the ones who assigned combat missions, remained stubborn. Their silence was louder than words. Still, she understood something vital. She couldn't control the orders. She couldn't control the prejudice. But she could control herself. And so, day by day, she sharpened her edge. It wasn't just technical mastery. She trained her body like a soldier, preparing for war. She lifted weights until her arms trembled, ran sprints in full gear under the punishing sun, and practiced, dragging heavy dummies across the ground, rehearsing for the possibility of rescuing wounded comrades. She practiced mental toughness too. She studied battlefield psychology, read about pilots who had cracked under fire, analyzed how stress destroyed decision-making. She taught herself breathing techniques to steady her heart rate in moments of chaos. More than once during grueling late-night runs, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. And every time, she forced herself back up. Because in combat, there would be no option to quit. Slowly, something changed in the unit. Those who had mocked her began to respect her. They might not have admitted it openly, but she could see it in their eyes. The shift from dismissal to recognition. One young lieutenant approached her quietly after a drill. "I used to think they were right," he confessed. "That women couldn't handle Apaches in combat. But then I watched you outfly everyone here. If anyone deserves to be out there, it's you." It wasn't validation she needed, but it was proof. She was breaking through the cracks of doubt. Still, the frustration remained. No matter how much she trained, her name never appeared on combat rosters. The wall of denial still stood, immovable. But unlike before, she no longer felt powerless. She was prepared in a way no one else was. And deep down, she believed fate would eventually intervene, because war was unpredictable. And when chaos struck, when the unit was stretched thin, when the unexpected happened, she would be ready to step in. And in that moment, there would be no question, no hesitation. She would not just fly, she would lead. One evening, as the sun set over the base, she stood on the tarmac, staring at the Apache lined against the horizon. The rotors were still, the machines silent, but in her mind, they roared to life. She thought of the years of struggle, the endless denial, the hours she had poured into preparation. She thought of the battles she had yet to fight, both in the air and against those who doubted her. She rested her hand against the fuselage and whispered, almost to herself, "When the call comes, I'll be ready." And she meant it. The desert heat shimmered on the horizon as the unit gathered in the operations room, the air thick with anticipation. Maps lined the walls, radios crackled, and officers shuffled stacks of briefing papers. War had escalated in the region, and the tempo of missions had doubled overnight. She sat in the back, as she always did, helmet resting on her knee. She had been through dozens of briefings before, each one ending the same way, her name absent from the combat roster. She had trained for years, prepared for this very moment, and watched from the sidelines as others flew into battle. But this time felt different. The unit was stretched thin. Pilots were exhausted. Aircraft rotated faster than crews could. Rest and missions were stacking up with dangerous frequency. The demand for manpower was too high. Command could no longer afford luxury. The mission commander read off the roster. Names echoed through the room. Anderson, Callahan, Ramirez. She braced herself for disappointment, the same sinking hollowness she had felt a dozen times before. Then it came. Her name, clear, unmistakable, written into the flight schedule, paired with an Apache crew chief she trusted. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. But the officer didn't pause, didn't smirk, didn't make a joke. It was official. She was going to war. The room carried on as if nothing monumental had happened, but for her, the world narrowed to the pounding in her chest. Her hands tightened. Around her helmet, knuckles white, as adrenaline surged like fire in her veins. Finally, after years of denial, excuses, and silence, the wall had cracked. Not because they suddenly believed in her, but because war had left them no choice. She didn't care why. All she cared about was this. She had her mission. The night before the flight, she barely slept. She lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, every sound amplified in the darkness. The hum of the air conditioning, the creak of boots in the hallway, the faint rumble of engines outside. Her mind replayed everything she had trained for. Startup. Checklists, weapon sequences, protocols. She ran through possible scenarios. Anti-aircraft fire, engine failure, radio silence. Her body pulsed with restless energy, caught between fear and exhilaration. At one point, she sat up and pulled the Apache manual from her locker. She had read it 100 times, but she traced the diagrams again, memorizing every line as though it were a prayer. Because tomorrow, there would be no second chances. Dawn broke in a blaze of orange as she walked onto the flight line. The Apache sat waiting, sleek and menacing, its rotors still. Ground crews moved around it with practiced efficiency, loading Hellfire missiles onto the pylons, checking hydraulics, fueling the tanks. She ran her hand along the fuselage, the cool metal grounding her nerves. For years she had prepared for this day. Now the machine was no longer just a symbol. It was her partner, her weapon, her survival. Her co-pilot, a seasoned warrant officer, approached with a tight smile. He had flown combat missions before, and though he had once been skeptical of her, today his eyes held something different. Quiet trust. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. Always. Inside the cockpit, the ritual began. Switches clicked, lights blinked, the low whine of the turbines rose into a roar. She moved through the checklist with steady precision, each motion automatic. After years of rehearsal, the radio crackled with calls from the other Apaches in the formation. Ground crews cleared them for takeoff. She eased the collective upward, feeling the weight of the aircraft rise from the ground, the vibrations pulsing through her bones. The Apache lifted into the sky. For the first time, she wasn't training. She wasn't simulating. She was flying into combat. The mission was simple on paper: provide close air support for ground troops pinned by insurgent fire in a valley. But nothing in war was ever simple. As they approached the coordinates, The landscape spread out beneath them. Jagged ridges, narrow passes, clusters of mud brick compounds. The valley below was alive with chaos. Dust clouds swirled from explosions. Radio chatter filled her headset with urgent voices. Ground units calling for immediate support, their positions under heavy fire. Targets ahead, her co-pilot said, scanning through the targeting system. Multiple firing points. She steadied her breathing, fingers poised on the controls. This was the moment, the test of everything she had worked for. Enemy fire lit up the sky as they descended into the valley. Tracer rounds streaked past, glowing lines of death cutting across the air. The Apache shuddered as rounds pinged against its armor. Her instincts screamed to pull back, but training overrode fear. "Hold steady," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She angled the helicopter low, weaving through the fire with calculated movements, positioning for an attack run. Her co-pilot locked onto a hostile position. "Missile ready," he called. She squeezed the trigger. The hellfire roared from the wing, streaking across the sky before slamming into the target with a thunderous explosion. A plume of smoke and souche. Fire rose from the valley floor. The radio erupted with cheers from the ground units. They were still alive. There was no time to celebrate. More fire poured from another ridge. She swung the Apache around, chain gun blazing, the 30mm shells tearing into enemy positions. Each burst shook the cockpit, but her hands were steady. For minutes that felt like hours, they danced in the chaos, dodging, firing, repositioning. Every move had to be precise. Every hesitation could cost lives. Through it all, she felt a strange calm settle over her. This was what she was made for. Not the sidelines. Not the endless drills. This, the battlefield. By the time the last target was silenced, her ammunition was nearly spent, the Apache scarred with dents and scratches. But the ground troops were safe, and she was still flying. As they turned back toward base, exhaustion set in. Her body trembled with adrenaline, her throat dry from the tension of holding her breath. The radio crackled with gratitude from the soldiers below. One voice stood out. "Whoever was in that bird, you saved us. We wouldn't be standing without you." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. After years of doubt, of being told she wasn't ready, of being denied, she had done it. She had flown into combat. She had brought her soldiers home. When the Apache touched down, the base seemed strangely quiet. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, unloading the weapons. She climbed out of the cockpit, legs shaky, helmet in hand. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then, slowly, pilots and crew began to approach. Some nodded. Others clapped her on the shoulder. A few simply looked at her with new eyes, the skepticism gone. Her co-pilot gave her a rare smile. "You did damn good up there." It wasn't praise she craved. It was acknowledgement. Proof that she had earned her place not by words, but by fire. That night, as she sat in her quarters, she replayed the mission again and again. The sounds, the sights, the adrenaline. She thought of the soldiers whose lives she had protected. She thought of the Apache, carrying her through the storm. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of doubt lift from her shoulders. She had been denied again and again. But when the call to battle finally came, she had been ready. And she had proved them all wrong. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the desert in shades of crimson as the squadron gathered on the flight line. The previous mission had been a proving ground, but today's operation was different. Intelligence reports confirmed insurgents were massing in greater numbers, equipped with heavier weapons, surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, and fortified bunkers. This wasn't just support. This was war at its most dangerous. She tightened her helmet strap, forcing her hands to stay steady. Her heart pounded, not from fear of failing herself, but from the knowledge that dozens of soldiers on the ground were depending on her Apache to hold the line. The briefing was direct. Ground forces were advancing into a valley suspected to be a stronghold. Previous reconnaissance had identified multiple defensive positions. Resistance was expected to be fierce. Apaches would provide close air support, drawing fire away from the infantry and eliminating threats before they could overrun the troops. It was the kind of mission that chewed up pilots, but it was also the kind of mission that defined them. As the turbines roared and the rotors spun up, she felt the familiar vibration course through her bones. She glanced at her co-pilot, a quiet veteran who had flown countless sorties. His eyes held no trace of doubt now, only a silent acknowledgement. This was the crucible. "Ready?" he asked through the intercom. She swallowed, steadied her voice, and answered, "Let's make this count." The Apache lifted into the early dawn sky, its silhouette slicing through the desert air. Below, armored convoys rolled across the sands, engines growling as soldiers prepared for contact. Radios buzzed with nervous chatter. The valley loomed. Ahead, jagged cliffs rising like teeth from the earth. It was the kind of terrain that swallowed units whole if the enemy held the high ground. And today, they did. The first shot came before they even crossed the ridgeline. A missile streaked upward, smoke trailing behind it like a deadly comet. "Missile! Break left!" her co-pilot shouted. She yanked the collective and banked hard, the Apache groaning under the strain. The missile flashed past, detonating harmlessly. In the sky behind them, the shockwave rattled the cockpit, but they were still flying. Her jaw clenched. This wasn't training anymore. This was survival. Below, tracer rounds lit the valley like fireworks, arcs of red and green cutting through the smoke. Insurgent guns thundered from concealed positions, targeting the advancing ground troops. The radio crackled with urgent calls. "Enemy fire from the North Ridge. We're pinned. Requesting immediate support. We can't move." The infantry was walking into a kill zone. "Targets locked," her co-pilot called out, scanning through the sensors. "North Ridge, multiple machine gun nests." "Copy." Taking the shot, she steadied her hands, thumb hovering over the trigger. She fired a burst from the Apache's chain gun, 30mm rounds tearing into the ridge. The explosions kicked up dust and rock, silencing one firing position. Another roared to life seconds later, multiple tangos still active. She pushed the Apache lower, skimming the ridgeline to draw fire away from the soldiers. Bullets hammered against the armored fuselage, sparks erupting as rounds pinged off the plating. The cockpit shook, alarms shrieking warnings, but she held steady. Her voice cut through the chaos, firm and sharp, engaging. "Stay with me?" The next Hellfire missile screamed off the wing, obliterating the bunker. Flames erupted, black smoke curling into the morning sky. The radio crackled again. "Direct hit. Keep it coming." But the enemy wasn't backing down. From the southern ridge, an anti-aircraft gun opened fire, shells ripping through the air with deafening fury. The first volley passed wide, but the second came dangerously close, the concussive blasts rocking the Apache. Her co-pilot swore, "They're bracketing us." Her training screamed retreat, but the soldiers below had no such option. She pulled the helicopter into a steep climb, twisting hard to avoid the fire, then dove back down toward the gun's position. "Hold on," she shouted as the Apache screamed in descent. The targeting system locked on to the anti-aircraft. Emplacement. She squeezed the trigger. Another missile streaked downward, slamming into the gun with a thunderous explosion. The blast sent debris spiraling, the weapon silenced. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She wasn't just flying. She was surviving second by second, each decision a razor-thin margin between life and death. Minutes blurred into chaos. The valley became a storm of smoke, fire, and thunder. Her Apache danced between ridges, unleashing hellfire and lead, every pass carving open space for the ground troops to advance. Still, the enemy fought with ferocity. They emerged from tunnels, firing RPGs, moving with practiced precision. Each time one position fell, another roared to life. Her fuel gauge dipped lower. Ammunition dwindled. Her body screamed with fatigue. Muscles locked in tension as she wrestled the controls. But giving up wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. At one point, a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the valley floor just meters from her Apache. The blast sent a shockwave rippling through the cockpit, alarms flaring as warning lights flashed red. She gritted her teeth, forcing the helicopter back under control. Her co-pilot's voice was strained but steady. Systems holding. "You're still in the fight." "Good," she shot back. "Because we're not done yet." She lined up for another run, chain gun spitting fire as she tore into enemy fighters pouring from a compound. The ground lit up with explosions, the valley echoing with thunder. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tide began to turn. Enemy fire slackened. Smoke curled from destroyed emplacements. The infantry on the ground pushed forward, their voices over the radio shifting from desperation to determination. Enemy retreating. Valley secure. Repeat, valley secure. The words washed over her like a wave of relief. She slumped back in her seat, muscles trembling, lungs burning from the intensity of it all. They had survived. More importantly, they had won. The flight back to base was silent, save for the hum of the engines. She stared out at the desert below, her mind replaying every moment. The missiles, the tracer fire, the explosions. Each second etched into her memory. She thought of the soldiers on the ground, alive because she had refused to break. She thought of the machine beneath her, scarred but unbroken, carrying her through the storm. This was her baptism under fire. And she had emerged not just as a pilot, but as a warrior. When they landed, the base seemed to hold its breath. Mechanics swarmed the Apache, counting bullet holes, checking systems. Fellow pilots watched in. Silence as she climbed down, helmet under her arm. Then the silence broke. Applause, shouts, nods of respect from those who had once doubted her. Her co-pilot approached, exhaustion etched across his face, but a rare smile tugged at his lips. "You didn't just survive. You led. You flew that bird like it was born with you." She met his eyes, her own voice quiet but firm. "That's what we're here for." That night, alone in her quarters, she sat with her flight journal open, pen poised over the page. She wanted to record every detail, every sound, every heartbeat of the battle. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because she never wanted to forget the moment she proved, to herself, to her unit, to the world, that she belonged. The pages filled with words, shaky at first, then steady. She ended with one simple line. "Today, I was tested. Today, I did not break." And as she closed the journal, exhaustion finally claiming her, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. The hangar smelled of burnt oil and scorched metal. Her Apache sat on the tarmac like a wounded beast, its fuselage pocked with bullet holes, rotor blades nicked, and paint scarred from the heat of battle. Technicians circled the aircraft, running, their hands over the battered skin, as though inspecting a veteran returning from war. For her, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep exhaustion she couldn't shake. Her body ached from hours of tension in the cockpit. Her head throbbed from the endless roar of engines and gunfire still echoing in her skull. But the mission was done. The valley was secure. Soldiers were alive because she had been there. And that fact, more than anything, gave her the strength to stand tall as she stepped down onto the hangar floor. At first, the silence unnerved her. The ground crew, pilots, and even commanders who had gathered stood watching, their faces unreadable. For months, she had lived under their scrutiny. Whispers about her capability, doubts spoken behind closed doors, subtle dismissals of her skill. She had grown accustomed to the weight of skepticism. Now that same silence pressed in again, but it felt different. It wasn't disbelief this time. It was acknowledgement. Her co-pilot broke the tension. Pulling off his helmet, sweat-soaked hair clinging to his forehead, he clapped a hand against her shoulder. "Hell of a flight," he said, his voice raw. "You flew like you've been doing this your whole life." The words echoed louder than any cheer. And then, slowly, the others joined in. A ripple of applause, nods of approval, voices raised in respect. The men who had once doubted her ability were giving her something they had withheld since the day she arrived: recognition. But respect in the military is a strange currency. It doesn't come from speeches or promises. It comes from action. From standing your ground when bullets cut the air, from making the hard choices in impossible moments, from proving in blood and fire that you belong. And she had proven it, not by demanding it, but by surviving, by leading, by refusing to yield when the valley threatened to swallow everyone whole. Her commander approached, the same man who had once reassigned her from combat sorties, citing excuses about readiness and protocol. His face was drawn, his jaw set, but there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Respect tempered with guilt. "You saved lives out there," he said simply. She met his gaze, her voice steady. "That's my job, sir." He nodded, but the silence that followed was heavy. Both of them knew what went unsaid. He had been wrong about her. That night, as the base quieted and the desert wind swept across the tents, she sat alone outside, staring at the stars. The sky was endless, the same sky she had looked up to as a child, dreaming of flight. But now, those dreams were weighed down by the reality of combat, the screams over the radio, the flash of explosions, the haunting memory of lives teetering on the edge. Respect was earned, yes, but the cost was steep. Her journal lay open. On her lap, pages already filled with notes from the mission. She wrote slowly, deliberately, capturing the details that refused to leave her mind. The way tracer fire looked like streams of fireflies, the deafening thump of the Apache's chain gun, the moment she thought they might not make it back. But, more than the battle, she wrote about the soldiers she had saved, the infantry pinned in the valley, the voices calling desperately for support. She didn't know their names, but their survival was now etched into her story. The following days brought change, though not in dramatic declarations. Change in the military is quiet, subtle, often hidden in gestures more than words. In the mess hall, men who once avoided her table now sat nearby, their conversations no longer laced with doubt. On the flight line, pilots asked her about maneuvering techniques, genuinely curious about her approach under fire. Even the older warrant officers, hardened by years of combat, began to nod in greeting when she passed. It wasn't universal acceptance. Some still held their prejudices tight, unwilling to admit a woman had proven them wrong. But the tide had shifted. The unspoken truth was clear. She had faced the fire, and not only survived, she had excelled. Her co-pilot, once skeptical himself, now became her fiercest advocate. In briefing rooms, he praised her instincts. In debriefings, he gave her credit openly. She flew that bird like no one else could, he told the unit. You can doubt what you want, but I was there. She kept us alive. Hearing those words felt strange. She didn't crave praise. She only wanted to do her duty, to fly, to serve. Yet the acknowledgement was more than validation. It was a door opening, not just for her, but for every woman who would follow. Because respect, once earned the hard way, doesn't stay contained. It spreads, it reshapes, it changes the system from within. Still, the weight lingered. Late at night, when the base was quiet, she felt the ghosts of the valley pressing in. Every pilot knows the cost of war. That survival is a thin line, and luck can change in an instant. For every mission won, there were others who didn't make it home. She carried that truth like a stone in her chest. Respect didn't erase it. Recognition didn't soften it. What it did, however, was remind her why she flew. Not for herself, but for those on the ground, for the soldiers who depended on the shadow of the Apache overhead. And perhaps, in time, that would be enough. Weeks later, another mission loomed. Different terrain, but the same dangers. This time, when her name appeared on the roster, there were no raised eyebrows, no quiet objections. She was listed not as an exception, not as a gamble, but as an equal. When she stepped toward the flight line, helmet in hand, she caught the eye of a young mechanic. He gave her a thumbs up, a grin breaking across his face. "Bring him back." "Safe, ma'am." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of transformation. She was no longer the outsider fighting for a place. She was a pilot among pilots, a warrior among warriors. In the end, respect didn't arrive with ceremony or medals. It wasn't handed down from a podium or enshrined in orders. It came in. The quiet nods, the shared silence before missions, the trust of those who now believed she would deliver them home. That was the hard way, the only way, really, to earn it. And though the battles ahead would test her again, she knew one thing. She no longer fought to prove she belonged. She had already proven it. Now, she fought because it was who she was. The desert wind carried sand across the airfield, scratching against metal and canvas. The Apache sat ready for another mission, its blades stretching wide like the wings of a predator. She walked toward it with steady steps, her helmet tucked. Beneath her arm, boots crunching against the gravel. But this time, there was no uncertainty in the way the crew watched her approach. No murmurs of doubt, no second-guessing glances. The men and women of the unit stood with quiet assurance, treating her not as an anomaly, not as an experiment, but as a pilot who had earned her place. It had taken months, even years, of proving herself in silence, of enduring dismissals and denials. And now, the evidence was etched in the scars of her aircraft, the battle reports filed by commanders, and most importantly, in the lives of soldiers who had walked back from the edge of death because she had been there. She had not just broken into the cockpit of the Apache, she had redefined what it meant to sit there. The story spread beyond her unit, carried through official channels, after-action reviews, and whispered in mess halls across the theater of war. Infantrymen told tales of the female pilot whose helicopter had swooped in at the darkest hour, raining precision fire that turned near defeat into survival. Her name began to ripple outward, not loudly at first, but steadily. At other bases, soldiers who had never seen her nodded knowingly when her story was mentioned. She had become proof, an answer to the skeptics who still clung to the old belief that combat aviation was no place for a woman. For years, women had worn the uniform, carried rifles, and flown aircraft, but there had always been ceilings, visible and invisible. She had shattered one in the only way possible, by doing the job so well that no one could deny her. Change, however, is rarely celebrated in the moment. Military culture, bound by tradition and caution, does not transform overnight. There were still officers who raised their eyebrows, still men who muttered about exceptions and luck. She knew those voices would not vanish quickly, but she also knew something they did not. She had already opened the door. Once open, a door can never be fully shut again. Back in the States, word reached flight schools and academies. Female cadets. Young women staring at cockpits with the same hungry determination she once had, repeated her story like a mantra. She had flown, she had fought. She had won out in classrooms where instructors still hesitated to push female students as hard as their male peers. Cadets now asked pointed questions. If she did it, why can't we? Her battle had not been just for herself. It had been for them. Months later, she found herself invited to speak at a military training facility. Standing before rows of young faces in crisp uniforms, she felt the weight of their expectations. Some looked at her with awe, others with curiosity, and a few with the skeptical glare she had once seen so often. She told them the truth, not the polished version, but the real one. She spoke of rejection, of being passed over for missions, of the nights she sat awake, questioning if the fight was worth it. She described the cockpit not as glory, but as responsibility, a place where mistakes cost lives. And she recounted the moment when everything came together, when training, determination, and sheer will allowed her to bring soldiers home from the jaws of death. Respect, she told them, her voice steady, is never given freely. You earn it by showing up, again and again, no matter how many times the door is slammed in your face. And when the moment comes, you prove, not with words, but with actions, that you belong. That's the only way forward. The room was silent when she finished. Silent, not out of disbelief, but because they understood. They were hearing not just a story, but a path. Her career continued, each mission adding to the tapestry of her legacy. She flew in different theaters, under different skies, carrying the same burden of responsibility each time. She knew that every sortie was more than a mission. It was another line in the argument she had been making since she first dreamed of flight. That courage knows no gender, that excellence is universal, that war recognizes only skill and resolve. Slowly, policy began to shift. Promotions no longer stalled at invisible ceilings. Rosters filled with more women's names. Helicopters lifted off with female pilots at the controls, their presence no longer seen as symbolic, but expected. She had not caused this change alone. Others had fought battles in different ways, in different times. But she had been one of the few to carry it onto the battlefield and win where it mattered most, in combat. There were moments of reflection, late at night, or during long flights over empty terrain, when she wondered how her younger self would feel seeing all this. The little girl who had once stared up at the sky, watching helicopters thunder overhead, would have been amazed. But she would have also understood, because even then, the dream had not been about recognition, it had been about flight itself. The raw, unshakable desire to master the machine, to rise above, to carve her path through the sky, no matter the obstacles. That desire had carried her through the laughter, the rejection, the doubt, and the fire. It had carried her to this moment. Not just flying, but leading, inspiring, reshaping. Years later, when she finally rotated out of combat assignments, her name carried weight beyond her unit, beyond her service branch. She was invited to panels, to historical retrospectives, to discussions about the role of women in modern warfare. At first, she resisted. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. She came to realize that symbols matter. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every young woman staring at helicopters, to every cadet facing skepticism, to every soldier fighting to prove they belonged in a place where tradition had said they didn't. If telling her story helped even one of them push forward, it was worth it. In time, her legacy became clear. Her name appeared in articles, cited in military studies, mentioned in recruitment campaigns. But more importantly, it lived in the actions of others. Female pilots began to rise in numbers. Missions carried women in the cockpit as naturally as men. The idea that combat aviation was a male-only domain started to fade into history, like a relic of a less enlightened time. She had not changed the world alone, but she had struck a blow against the walls that once hemmed her in, and others had followed through the breach. That was enough. On her last deployment, as she flew an Apache over a foreign landscape, she looked down at the soldiers below, men and women alike, moving together as one. The sound of rotor blades filled her ears. Steady and strong, the machine responded to her touch, as it always had, obedient and powerful. Its chain gun ready, its missiles primed. But for once, she wasn't thinking about the fight ahead. She was thinking about the sky itself. She had taken it back. She had redefined it. And somewhere, she knew, a little girl was staring upward, watching a helicopter thunder by, daring to dream that one day she too could be at the controls. The cycle had begun again, but this time the door would already be open.